would like to call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 86 of the House of Commons, pursuant to Standing Order 1038 of the Standing Order, the motion adopted by the committee on September 23. The committee meets to resume its study on the economic development of official languages minority communities. I will be brief in my directives for those of you who are joining us virtually, because we've been doing 3 years on Zoom, so we should be used to it. But as we always do, regarding the connection tests, I would like to inform the committee that all of you who have done their test, this is necessary before the beginning of any meeting. Everything is consistent so that everything can be heard from our interpreters, to ensure that we can work smoothly in both official languages. Today we've got wonderful visits during our first hour. Mr. Gilles Grenier, Professor Emeritus from the University of Ottawa, personally, and from Futurepreneur Canada, Ms. Karen Graff-Young, Chief Executive Officer, who's joining us by video conferences. Before I begin, we'd like to apologize as a committee that those are the ups and downs of parliamentary life. We had a vote, as a result of which we're a little bit behind in our schedule by some 15 minutes. So I'm going to be very strict as to time. Dear witnesses, you have 5 minutes to deliver your opening remarks. It is now 4, so we've lost half an hour. What do we do about the session which was scheduled for an hour? We're going to have a first complete hour, then we'll have a second hour with shortened time. In other words, what does this mean? What does this mean in actual fact? 50% then. Well, that's not what I meant. We'll end at 4:30. Then we'll welcome our next guest. Or we can divide it into 45. Is that amenable to everybody? I know that you have some major obligations to fulfill, because we do have to move ahead. I do agree, so the committee is in agreement. 45 minutes. We begin with Mr. Grenier. You have 5 minutes. I will be very strict in terms of timekeeping, because this will enable us to have more time for our questions and responses. Mr. Grenier, you have the floor. Good afternoon. I'd like to thank you for your invitation. I'm Professor Emeritus at the Department of Economics at the University of Ottawa. I would like to present some results from my past research that is relevant to the concerns before this committee. This research focuses on the economics of the labor market and studied, among other things, the links between linguistic attributes and immigration on the one hand, that is salaries, and economic performance on the other. This research focused on Canada as a whole, as well as Quebec, and a little bit on the other provinces such as Ontario, New Brunswick. The data came from different Canadian censuses, and I used very strict economic data in order to analyze the database on a number of different variables. In brief, here are a few of the results that I was able to obtain thanks to this research. In Quebec, there has been an improvement in the relative income and economic status of French speakers since the 1970s. I also conducted research in Ontario, and what I noted there is very interesting, because the relative income of Francophones are very high, but that is not the issue here. The problem is that in Ontario is the fact that the proportion of French speakers has decreased significantly depending on immigration. So many Francophones are losing French as a language spoken at home. It's only 2%. Now, in New Brunswick, the data is interesting as well, because the proportion of French speakers has dropped a little while many of them are still Anglophones, but there has been a very good catch-up in the last few years. So the proportion of French speakers in New Brunswick has dropped a bit, but is holding up. The Francophonie in New Brunswick is sustaining. Now in Ontario, there's another issue. There is economic status, and it remains good. I also conducted some studies on immigration and the impact of immigration on official languages. My recent research specifically focused on Quebec and mainly on Montreal, with the aim of identifying how immigrants integrate into the French-speaking or English-speaking communities in terms of language spoken at home and the language used at work. Overall, research findings show that immigrants use more English and less French at home compared to non-immigrants, and immigration therefore contributes to increasing the weight of English and to reduce the weight of French. In Quebec, that is true, as is the case in other provinces. However, until about 2016, in Quebec, there have been new cohorts of immigrants that more and more used French, such that the effect of Anglicization was minimal. However, unfortunately for French, in the 2021 census, we see an increase that is an inversion of that trend. That is, many of these immigrants tended to use English more than French and continue to do this to the detriment of French. Research shows that the country of origin of immigrants are decisive in the choice of the language in which they integrate. Because of the importance of English worldwide, immigrants are therefore led to choose this language if they don't already have a link or tie to French. So, to a large extent, the country of origin of immigrants determine which language they'll use. We also looked at the impact of working language on income, both for the Francophone, Anglophone groups in Quebec and in immigrant groups. The result is somewhat disappointing. With respect to French, the research shows that for Francophones, it's profitable to work in English. And for an Anglophone, even though an Anglophone might be bilingual, there is no increase in salary due to working in French. And it's an interesting combination. I realize I have little time left, but what's interesting is that those who worked in English, that is about 75% and about 25% in French, they earned a higher income than those who worked only in English or only in French. English is a must, whereas Quebec is simply an asset. That's how we could see it. And I also conducted research on immigrants in Quebec, and we saw the same results, that it was of interest for immigrants to work on their English because they were able to earn higher wages. So in the context, English is the main international language, where immigration is the main source of population growth. And I conclude it is increasingly difficult to maintain a linguistic balance in Canada. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Grenier. Ms. Graves-Young.
Thank you very much, dear members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. My name is Karen Graves-Young. I am the CEO of Futurepreneur Canada. We are a national nonprofit organization that helps diverse, aspiring entrepreneurs launch successful businesses across the country. We have a long-standing partnership with the Government of Canada, consistently working together since 2001. And in fact, in Futurepreneur's 27-year history, we've supported more than 17,700 entrepreneurs ages 18 to 39 in launching more than 14,000 businesses spanning every province and territory. Quebec has been our largest province to date. Our unique model combines up to $60,000 of collateral-free loan financing alongside one-to-one mentorship, and we have a unique partnership with the BDC through which we co-lend our resources. We fill a critical gap by helping diverse young entrepreneurs who otherwise might struggle to access the financing and mentorship they need to launch a successful business. We provide all of our services in both official languages, French and English, to all our clients across the country, no matter where they are. As a national Canadian organization, we always ensure that we can consistently serve entrepreneurs in the official language of their choice. And in fact, I've been with Futurepreneur for 5 years. Since I joined, we've grown our bilingual capacity by 82% to ensure seamless client support in both official languages. Today, all of Futurepreneur's 120 employees are fluent in English, and nearly 50% of our staff are fluent in French, either Francophone or fully bilingual. We have the capacity to communicate with and serve all clients and members of the public in either official language at any time in any region. Our Quebec-based staff are all fully bilingual and can serve English-speaking clients as well as Francophone clients. And we purposefully invest in Francophone talent, skills, and experience outside of Quebec to best serve and represent the diverse needs and experiences of official language minority communities. Over half of our French-speaking staff are located outside Quebec, and every Futurepreneur team has at least one fully bilingual team member. Nous avons également plus d'une douzaine de membres de l'équipe, comme moi-même,
More
qui
than
sont
12 members of our team,
capables
such
de
as
mener des
myself,
affaires
are
en
able
français,
to
bien qu'ils ne
conduct
maîtrisent pas
operations in French,
complètement.
although we are
Ils
not
ne sont pas
entirely fluent.
comptés parmi
Nevertheless,
les 50% de notre équipe
they
qui sont
are not
parfaitement
included
bilingues.
among the 50 members of our team who are completely bilingual.
Futurepreneur is committed to inclusive economic impact and achieves this by helping diverse young entrepreneurs start and succeed. Recognizing and elevating the diversity of OLMC entrepreneurs, including newcomers, BIPOC entrepreneurs, 2S LGBTQIA+ entrepreneurs, and people with disabilities means taking an intersectional approach and understanding that linguistic barriers may be part of a wider set of systemic barriers. As we are meeting during Black History Month, I do want to specifically note the importance of supporting Black entrepreneurs across Canada, many of whom are francophones outside of Quebec. One of the entrepreneurs who received a loan and mentorship through Futurepreneur's Black Entrepreneur Startup Program is Ingrid Roussillon, a francophone newcomer who settled in Vancouver. Ingrid is the founder of Criote Polyglot, a company focused on team building and personal development through theater workshops. We recently featured Ingrid in our Black History Month storytelling campaign with an interview that you can find on our social media channels that seamlessly goes between French and English. Her story highlights the importance of ensuring that the entrepreneurial ecosystem can support OLMCs anywhere in Canada. In fact, Futurepreneur's Black Entrepreneur Startup Program team, who are all members of the Black community, are bilingual, able to provide services in French or English. Our Indigenous Entrepreneur Startup Program, which is fully staffed by members of Indigenous communities, also has members who can provide services in both English and in French. I do want to highlight the importance of partnerships with local, regional, and national organizations, associations, and networks that support OLMC entrepreneurs. Futurepreneur works with a variety of partners and organizations focused on OLMCs to refer or recruit entrepreneurs, share information and best practices, and to work on collaborative initiatives. This model has been highly successful, and we consistently work with the ecosystem across Canada to ensure that programs adequately serve diverse young entrepreneurs in OLMCs, thus contributing to Canada's inclusive socioeconomic development. We're supportive.
Thank you, Mrs. Young. Can you conclude in 10 seconds?
Yes, supporting OLMC entrepreneurs has been and will continue to be core to Futurepreneur's work, and we look forward to continuing our successful partnership with the Government of Canada in support of inclusive economic development. Thank you.
Merci, Madame Young. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Let's begin with our first round of questions. Each party has 6 minutes to ask questions and hear responses. It will be interactive. It's interactive. We begin with Mr. Joël Gaudin, the first ISD. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Young and Mr. Grenier. The study being conducted is trying to understand what good practices exist in the regions in a minority language situation. Mr. Grenier, you mentioned that in Quebec, bilingual persons earn higher incomes. But do you have any data regarding official language minority communities outside of Quebec to understand whether or not these communities are seeing an uptake or a downswing economically? We'll speak about demographics after. I conducted studies over time, but I don't have the most recent data on hand. It goes too far back. Could you give us a rough estimate? Well, I believe I did say this. In Ontario, economic results show that Franco-Ontarians economically are doing well. The Franco-Ontarian community is very lively. It has entrepreneurs. As to the data that we have on the labor force and revenues, and the data was very positive. And I didn't check all of the provinces, but generally, yes, I think in New Brunswick, the situation was positive as well. There's been an improvement with respect to the Acadian community in New Brunswick. They're doing quite well economically. So from the viewpoint of the value of a constitution, the Francophone communities, at least in Ontario and New Brunswick, are dynamic. they contribute to society, and they're seeing good economic conditions. I'd like to ask the same question of Ms. Young.
Vous êtes ouverte à avoir de nouvelles bonnes initiatives. Quelles seraient ces initiatives-là pour améliorer?
These initiatives be? And what kind of tools would you be giving to the official languages community who are in a minority situation so that economically speaking, they be better and it be attractive to allow Francophones who live outside of Quebec to be able to go and live and work in these regions?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. I will approach it actually from our employee side as well as our services side. So as I mentioned, close to half of our bilingual employees live outside of Quebec. And in fact, we do pay a premium to employees who have English and French because we value having French language in order to serve Francophone Canadians wherever they live. In terms of our services, again, we have Francophone or French, fluent in French.
Madame Young, je m'excuse de vous interrompre, Madame Young.
Sorry to interrupt you, Madam Young. I'm sorry to interrupt you. What I understand your organization has a certain structure and employees, but what I'm trying to understand here concretely, what would you like to have extra as a tool in your toolbox to allow your organization to be better and accompany people who want to go and live in communities outside of Quebec?
Oh, that is interesting. Sorry, I did not fully understand your question. We currently already serve Francophone Canadians, regardless of where they live. So we have Francophone team members throughout the country. An additional tool, which we are currently doing, but could use more of, are partnerships with organizations that are in rural communities where we have a number of Francophone Canadians. So we currently have 21 partnerships. We could have more to ensure that we have people in place in addition to our staff members. Having online tools is also very helpful so that an Anglophone in Quebec or a Francophone wherever they are across the country has access to all of our webinars, which are always seamlessly delivered in French and English.
I'm just going to stop you here because I don't have a lot of time. I'm sorry to interrupt you. What I really want to know is, what would you like to ask the government so that the regions become more attractive and more prosperous? What can we give you as a tool that you can use in order to develop the prosperity of regions where there are official languages in a minority situation?
So Futurepreneur is currently up for funding renewal with the federal government. The federal government's funds help us ensure that we can deliver our services. As I said, we seamlessly deliver our services in French or in English. However, we need funding in order to employ the people who work with entrepreneurs and give them mentorship and give them funding. So to be honest, I think more of what the government is currently doing to support those organizations that are supporting Francophones outside of Quebec, we partner with them today. We'd like to continue partnering, and we need to continue doing our work in order to make that happen. We do provide everything in both languages today, and I think the fact that the government celebrates both languages is brilliant. Thank you. I know I'm not getting exactly to the answer that you're asking me for, but I'm feeling very supported, and I hope that we are supporting entrepreneurs as they would like to be supported wherever they are.
Merci, Madame Young. Thanks, Madame Young.
Thank you very much, Madam Young.
Les prochaines questions nous viendront de la
The next questions will come from Mr. Angelo Iancuno for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to all witnesses for their presence here today. Mr. Gradier, your specialty in economics obviously have a lot to do with bilanguages, minority languages, working languages, as well as immigrants. The work of this committee is to think about all of the different questions that affect all official languages communities who are in minority situation, notably the ones outside of Quebec. What you have written is mainly to do with Montreal and Quebec, generally speaking. Do you have any specific knowledge about French language communities outside of Quebec? A little. Yes, you are right that most of what I have written about has to do with Quebec and especially Montreal. I wrote an article about 20 years ago about Francophones in New Brunswick and in Ontario. And more recently, a master's student, I asked a master's student to put things up to date for the figures because it was 20 years ago, the figures. So like I said, this study for New Brunswick showed that there had been an important improvement of the economic condition for Francophones and for educational levels had actually caught up. And when we analyzed people's incomes, there were no important gaps from the point of view of salary between the Francophones and the Anglophones. And in fact, sometimes it was a trend to in favor of the Francophones. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Grenier. And Mr. Chair, could we ask the witness to share with us these latest data as soon as they will have been published? I have another question for you, Mr. Grenier. Last November, the federal government announced new targets for immigration. By 2026, the government wants to greet 6 to 7% and then 8% of Francophone immigrants. What do you think of these new target figures? I think they're very ambitious. I'm not sure that we will be able to reach them. I think they have they have them for outside of Quebec. If I understood correctly, they've only been reached one time, and my impression is that because there's such an important increase in percentage, 500,000 immigrants are expected per year over the next few years. So I think that these figures are going to be quite difficult to reach. But nevertheless, I encourage the government to make efforts in that respect and make sure that there are a certain number of Francophone immigrants coming in. Most of them do tend to go to Quebec, but there are people from Algeria, Morocco, Haiti, and France who come to Canada either to study or to work. But like I said, most of them do settle in Quebec, but some might go to Ontario. How could the IRCC increase the pool of Francophone immigrants and improve the recruitment? That's not an easy answer. Because the pool of immigrants who are going to meld into English is higher than those who are going to go towards French language, because we know that English is the dominant language everywhere. So we have a lot of immigrants from India, Philippines, China, and Asia, from generally speaking. And in those countries, even if they're not officially Anglophone, of course, China is not an Anglophone country, but it is the second dominant language. And so most of the people are going to express themselves in English. And even if they go to Quebec, it's difficult to integrate them into French language. So the pool of Francophones is always smaller. But that doesn't mean that French is a dead language. Far from it. It is an international language that is still important. And in Africa and in Northern Africa, for instance, Algeria and Morocco, and in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as in countries such as Senegal, Congo and Ivory Coast, they also have immigrants who may come to the other Canadian provinces. So thank you very much for saying that the French language is not dead. So the IRCC announced a new immigration policy. Do you have any comments in that regard that you would like to share with the committee? You mean the new policy of admitting 500,000 immigrants per year. Personally, I think it is too numerous. I have expressed this opinion in the past. When I made suggestions for Quebec, I've always thought that Quebec levels of immigration were reasonable and it was too high for the rest of Canada. But we see it now. We're talking about the housing crisis, and the population in Ontario has increased so rapidly. There's little housing available, and it's difficult to integrate people. So I think these targets are too high. They're twice as high as they used to be. Thank you, Mr. Grenier. You might get into more details in the next question. So the next question will be from the Bloc Québécois by our second Vice President of the committee, Mr. Mario Beaulieu. You have the floor for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. Mr. Grenier, you published an article in 2019 called Quebec Language Policy and Language and Globalization. And in the summary of the article, we can see that there was an improvement in the purchasing power, better control of the economy by Francophones in Quebec. But you've also said that in the workplace, working in English pays more than working only in French. And I think that the main difference, well, we had studies that sort of said the opposite. And it said that Anglophones have more unemployment, are poor, but they use the median rather than the average. So in your case, you were looking at the workplace language. Could you explain more? Well, there are several methodologies you can use to compare incomes, of course. In our case, and I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty, but there are economists who compare the salaries, and they use micro data, which is called the human capital's earnings function. So we look at salary progressions with all of the variables, the level of education, level of experience, etc. And we added in working place language, which was we tried to compare what the impact of the working language was on salaries. And for immigrants, we had somewhat disappointing results. We studied this in Montreal, and we noticed that it paid better to work in English than it did to work in French. So we know that there are courses to learn how to speak French once you get to Montreal, but when you are arriving, you have to learn French and English in order to be able to function properly. So Quebec is in a slightly different situation than, let's say, Toronto or the rest of Canada. You arrive in Toronto, you just have to learn one language, but if you arrive in Quebec, you've got to learn French as well. And so very often people have to learn English as well as French. And the immigrants who come from Francophone from countries, of course, speak French, but they don't necessarily speak English. So you've said, so in spite of the progress made by Francophones, the situation is still preoccupying. The idea would be to integrate more immigrants into the majority of French-speaking people. So the mandate to protect French was a big thing, of course. So isn't it a little bit incoherent with the idea of official languages in order to support the development of official languages? Because in Quebec, it's all it would have to be completely dedicated towards French and support groups that are going to recruit immigrants for English places. Well, you're looking at the needs of Anglophones in Quebec. I think that immigrants well, Quebec is such an interesting place. We don't need to use. Well, we don't need to increase more the usage of English. I'll stick to that. But so you've said in Ontario the situation for francophones has very much improved. Could that not be because they speak more in English and they work more in English? Well, bilingualism has certainly increased if we compare over the last few years.
Today, English is an international language. It's the lingua franca globally. It's not only true here, it's true in Europe as well, because in Europe are complaining about the predominance of English and how perilous it is. We're not there yet in Quebec, but we might be facing it. I think to a certain extent, it's fine to use English to communicate all over the world when we're abroad. But again, I think there is still room for French. Internationally, yes, English is a major language in Africa, in Asia, in the Americas as well. I'm an economist, so I believe that French should be able to compete with English, although we know that English dominates so much of the world, that French will never be able to compete completely, but it has to try. So I think some activities such as research activities, commercial activities should also be done in French. Well, there must be in other countries such as Italy and others where they've experienced this. But Italians maintain their spot in the labor force. Yes, the difference is that in these countries, English is a second language, and they speak it, but it is Italian that dominates, whereas in Quebec, we've always had that issue. I'm afraid that's all the time you have. Thank you very much. The last question, 6 minutes from Manitoba, the northern Manitoba. Ms. Ashton, you have the floor for 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup. Et j'aimerais diriger.
Thank you very much. I would like to direct my first question to Ms. Grave-Young. It has to do with the obstacles that entrepreneurs face. We've heard a number of times before this committee that there was an insufficient number of childcare services available in French in affordable daycares. Could you perhaps share with us to what extent access to childcare services are important in enabling entrepreneurs to seize opportunities, the ones that you work with?
Access to childcare is a priority for both women and men entrepreneurs under 40 that we support. Those are very much childbearing years. In fact, some of the entrepreneurs we've supported have started daycares for their communities, and those are the businesses because there is so much demand. And in fact, several of those businesses are francophone childcare outside of Quebec, because as you identified, that is very much a need that we've seen. That's anecdotal. I would say entrepreneurs' resources that are the most valuable are their time and the money that they need and the advice that they get. And so childcare, that is freeing up their time to do their business. So that is a need. I don't have hard data on that, but anecdotally, yes. They also need funding, and they need funding without fear of discrimination. And that's something that we provide. And that's why having it available in both languages and adjudicated in both languages is important wherever entrepreneurs are. And they need mentorship and coaching. And they need mentorship and coaching in the language that they're most comfortable in, either French or English.
Okay, thank you very much for sharing that, and great to hear about the work that the entrepreneurs you're working with are doing on childcare as well, and especially francophone childcare services. Okay, j'aimerais aussi diriger une question à Monsieur Grenier.
I would like to address a question to Mr. Grenier as well. We know that in terms of the federal public service, that the federal government recognizes that there is the need to financially support those in the public service who speak both languages, but where it is necessary to ensure that they have access to learning a language. Do you believe that this would be an important approach in other areas of employment across the country? Well, this is about encouraging bilingualism in the private sector, in other areas, such as we try to do in the public service, the federal public service. Yes, certainly. I think that there should be more bilingual persons in Canada who speak French. There are many Anglophones who learn French in courses, but unfortunately, they have very few opportunities to practice their French because they mostly work in English. But I think efforts should be deployed in all workplaces throughout Canada to make these more bilingual, especially in Quebec. In Quebec, it's completely normal to work in both languages. In services in Quebec, for example, in restaurants in Quebec, you can be served in either English or French. That's possible. We'd like to see that in Ottawa, where the servers would be able to enable one to order in French English, but often we don't do this because we're afraid to ask in French because we're afraid they won't understand us. So I think we should encourage more and more people to work in both official Canadian languages. That would be what distinguishes us as Canadians compared to Americans, is that we speak both languages, because Americans only speak one language. I don't know if that answers your question. Yes, yes. That's a very important idea. At this committee, we've often spoken about the link between education and economic development. We know that in Canada, we're all seeing a substantial labor shortage, especially when it comes to French language educators. Our schools need teachers. Our childcare services need these, as do schools. And I'd like to ask you whether or not you believe that the federal government commit to finding solutions in partnership, of course, with the provinces and educational organizations to find solutions to this labor shortage. Is this part of finding solutions regarding economic development as well? Yes, there are labor shortages in all sectors. In the education sector, more specifically, as well as in the healthcare sector. Of course, we need to make efforts to hire more educators, more teachers who are able to teach in French. But as I've mentioned, it's not an easy thing to do because there are labor shortages across the board. Thank you very much. That's all the time we have left for this first part, because at 4:45 we have to temporarily suspend and do sound tests for our witness. I'd like to thank the witnesses for being with us today, and thank you for having shared your thoughts and knowledge with us. If you believe, however, that we should receive additional information, please don't hesitate to send that information to our clerk. She will take that written information and will share all of that with the rest of the committee, and it has the same value as verbal evidence.
Don't hesitate, just provide that to our clerk, and she will share that with all the members of this committee. Donc, merci beaucoup de votre présence, tout le monde, et puis nous suspendons.
Thank you very much for being with us, and we'll suspend for a few moments.
témoin de deuxième heure.
We're resuming our session. Welcome again to our witness for the second portion. Welcome to Pierre-Marcel Desjardins, professor at the University of Moncton. The last time I saw you had a few less white hairs. And Mr. Devaux as well from Nova Scotia. So welcome to you from Nova Scotia. Welcome. So what are we going to do? You're each going to have approximately 5 minutes to explain what you would like to speak to us about, and I will have to cut you off at 5 minutes. This gives the members more time to ask you questions, and this will be followed by an interactive question and answer session with you and with the various members from our political parties who are being very nice these days. So that said, Mr. Desjardins will begin with you for 5 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm a professor of economics at the University of Moncton. I had other positions, including the president of the board of directors of Iridic Canada for 2 years. I would like to introduce 4 points. In economics, we don't sufficiently stress what we could call transaction costs. And language is a component. There is geographic proximity, historical proximity, but also the cultural proximity that influences language. And with the increase in the French-speaking population, French that will be speaking French, that is given the growth in Africa, is that French is becoming more and more important. The second point, and that is often important for companies, when we need to have access to a labor force, the statistic we refer to, or the main characteristic we refer to is mother tongue. That is, there are 79,000 francophones here who speak French as a first language, but 62,000 who can speak French. So often when we're speaking about economic developments, it's as important to look at the ability to speak in French when we conduct our analysis. My third point now, often when we speak about bilingualism, we refer to French. And again, I'm speaking mostly about the New Brunswick context. Often we have a sense that it's mainly bilingual person of French people that we refer to. But here I refer to what we call the center or customer call centers that we have in Quebec. In Quebec, the percentage of the labor force that is only francophone, that is persons who only speak that language, is 56%. But in these customer contact centers, that's 66%. Again, when you call 1-800, we say always here, 1 if you want to speak in French, 2 in English. Technology, it leads these calls to persons. So unilingual Anglophones benefit from the presence of the French language community.
C'est souvent mes études, en particulier au Canada Atlantique et plus spécifiquement au Nouveau-Brunswick. Si on regarde les moyennes,
in New Brunswick, we can have the perception that the Francophone community is perhaps less performing from an economic point of view. But if you look at it county by county, riding by riding, Francophones do generally better than their Anglophone counterparts in the same riding. So what happens is that Francophones are concentrated in rural regions, whereas Anglophones tend to be more in the urban areas. And I heard the two people who spoke previously. When we're talking about public policy, it's extremely important to have policies that develop rural policies and development, because that is where the Francophones largely are. And when you move because of financial and economic reasons in urban areas, the assimilation increases. So among targeted programs, we can think of childhood programs, offering them in French or bilingual, government services for arts and cultures. Anything that we can bring to a rural setting will contribute to the promoting of Francophone communities, because very often they are mostly in rural areas. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Desjardins. Now for the economic development of New Brunswick. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to speak to you. I hope that I will be as efficient as the previous speaker. I am Kenneth Devitt. I am a part of the Economic Development Council for Nova Scotia. I have a PhD and I was a director of St. Anne, and I was the founding member of IFES Nova Scotia. I was VP and VP of the University of Nova Scotia also. And recently, I completed the accelerator program for the regional accelerator program. So I was very interested in economic development right from the beginning of my career. I want to share my thoughts with you and perhaps give you some ideas. We're talking here today about the vitality of our communities, and the vitality of a community can come down to three different factors. But first of all, it's the capacity of that community to be a distinct entity, to be able to flourish. And so the status of the group, its language, and its culture. Its institutional aspects, and as well as demographics, which are very important, but are often the consequence of the previous two factors. When it comes to status, so of course, in economics, and I was listening with great interest to the previous speaker, so the language, we know that the language of commerce is English. We know that it's the case internationally, but nevertheless, there are places where French has a particular status. And I think that we should perhaps think more about those areas, especially when we're thinking about commercial exchanges in our communities. For instance, in Quebec, can we promote more commercial exchanges between Baie-Sainte-Marie and Quebec, for instance, as an example? Are there areas specifically where we could look more? And I think we could work more on areas that already exist rather than creating new ones. I'm thinking culture, education, etc. Institutions. You talked about institutions and have really looked at the whole issue of education. From JK all the way up, a very important factor. This also has a lot to do with the vitality of our communities. So from the point of view of community, I'm looking more at post-secondary because of time. So in Nova Scotia, after seafood products, especially lobsters, the main important, the most important product in terms of farm gates is post-secondary education. St. Anne University is definitely got its fair share. International students are extremely important to our Francophone economy in Nova Scotia. And it's more than just the school fees. It's a qualified manpower and clients for our various businesses. I am sure that this is a window to international markets, whether it's Northern Africa, Africa itself, or Europe. There are avenues to explore and develop. Now, finally, the demographic issue. The mobility. This is where we're losing people, and it's a double loss. They leave our regions, like in Madawaska. Mr. Arsenault knows this very well. So they go for universities somewhere else, and then we're losing not only our young people, but we're losing the future leaders, and very often they don't come back. How can we get them back? How can we repatriate them? Before, we wanted to develop only businesses, but of course, with flexible ways of working now, we could perhaps explore these issues more. We've talked about immigration in this committee. And of course, immigration, Francophone immigration, is among the priorities of the Canadian Francophonie and the Canadian federal government. I would like to talk to you about a specific project that we are doing at our Baie-Sainte-Marie Economic Council, and you will allow me to make certain recommendations during your question period. Thank you very much for giving me this time to speak to you. I'm anxious to answer your questions. Thank you, Mr. Deveau. So the first questions will be 6-minute longs for each one of the parties. So there will be questions and answers interactive. We will start with Mr. Joël Godin, who is the first. So the floor is yours, Mr. Godin. I am VP of the present committee, first VP. Okay. So, Mr. Jardin and Mr. Deveau, thank you so much for being with us today. What you are saying is music to my ears. You give us a lot of food for thought in order to be able to equip the regions that are in minority language situations to make sure that they continue to prosper and grow. My first question is for Mr. Desjardins. Do you have access to all of the data necessary in order to be able to give us a complete portrait of the situation when it comes to Francophone entrepreneurs? Well, how do you define an entrepreneur is the issue. Is it a business leader who speaks French but his employees are English? Are we talking about somebody who owns a foreign business? The most important challenge sometimes is the definition itself. Statistics Canada, with all of its census, has said how it's difficult to have access to this information, even if we can make a precise definition. Certain analyses have to be made. So it is a real challenge to define this. I understand. So this would be a useful tool for you to be able to make economic forecasting if you were able to look at French language in minority situation. So let's look at Francophone regions. What I understand is that you can still create certain categories of entrepreneurs that are Francophone. But what you're also saying is that Stats Canada should give you access to this data specifically so that you be able to be more efficient. Yes, precisely. The data that we often use are from the census. We are not necessarily given this data to analyze the inside of a business. Well, it's more on households. So it comes to we try to make the link between the employees and where they work. Yes, we have statistics on working languages, but then when we want to create a link between that and the kind of business and the kind of markets they lived, are they exporting it to Francophone markets, Anglophone, where? So we need all that data in order to have a complete portrait of the situation. We have to carry out surveys ourselves, go into the businesses and ask, rather than get other kinds of data, unless we're trying to just look for a socio-demographic profile of a region. For instance, I saw studies where they compared the Gaspé region to the north part of New Brunswick. But if you want to compare businesses to businesses, it becomes more complicated. So it's not the same reality. Thank you, Mr. Desjardins. Mr. Deveau, you said a while ago that the international student population was extremely important to maintain the vitality of the communities that are in a minority language situation. So there's the demographic aspect, which you said was important, but also the economic aspect. Could you elaborate? Yes, of course. The international students, in our perspective, is a clientele, but they're also a resource. So international students establish themselves in our regions, even if it's only for a few years. They go to businesses, they buy, they are clients. They are an important part of the clientele, especially in Baie Sainte Marie, but they are also highly qualified labor, qualified for our businesses and for our employers in the end. So I think that this is a underexploited opportunity, and we can create more international links with them. I'd like to come back to the issue of research. More than the Statistics Canada data, we also need tools such as the Economic Development Council in order to be able to establish links with organizations such as Mr. Desjardins in order to be able to study the economy of our regions. When we have a project, we can have a good idea even if we don't have the necessary data at the right time. Thank you, Mr. Deveau. My question is for both of you, Mr. Desjardins, Mr. Deveau. Would it be possible to give the committee the proper practices that you have in your environment in order to be able to inspire ourselves and share your knowledge with all the communities of the kind in Canada. Is it possible for each one of you to give us what kind of tools are necessary as well? So we've talked about data, statistics, of course, it's very important, but there's other things. And because we don't have a lot of time available right now, I'm asking both of you, and could you give us in writing your answers? And this would allow us to have a better report and help the government to be more proactive and carry out the correct gestures to increase the attractiveness for these communities and allow us to keep our young people, allow us to keep our knowledge and incite the international students to stay among us. And of course, to incite people to use French. Yes, of course, with pleasure. So the next questions come from the shyest person of the group, Daryl Sampson from the Liberals. 6 minutes, the floor is yours. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Desjardins and Mr. Lebeau. It's always a pleasure to hear you, Mr. Deveau. You seem to be in fine form today. I know you love questions that have to do with research, so I'll take this opportunity. So 2 very important questions for me and for your network. You had a national summit last year, and you explained that the most important thing is that we have to have, as a government, a plan that is specifically for the economic and French communities. Could you give us more details? What would this plan look like? Among the factors that had been identified was early childhood.
Parce qu'on a également l'immigration.
It's about early childhood, because when we speak about this, these are often people who want their children to grow up in French. However, when they come to a French language community, a minority community outside of Quebec, they want to ensure that they have early childhood education services available to them. And the schools are also another topic that is of importance, because often when immigrants come to Canada and end up in regions where French is not a majority language, they want to be able to raise their children in French. And that goes beyond simply speaking French at home. Thank you very much, Mr. Desjardins. I really appreciate, but I would also like to ask a further question on immigration. I'd like to ask Mr. Deveau to also speak to this issue. Thank you very much, Mr. Sanson, for giving me the opportunity to speak. I'd like to come back to the notion of truly developing a well-thought-through and progressive strategy that is research-based. I truly believe that research is at the heart of this. There's academic research, but there's also applied research. And there should be measures taken as we develop this. That's very important. Let me give you an example of a project that we've put in place. Well, I know you want to speak about this, but I can't allow this because somebody else will be able to give you time to do this. But certainly you can send us this example, this strategy you mentioned. You can send it to us, because I don't want to let go of my second question. With all due respect, Mr. Deveau, I'd like to know this. Young people are leaving our communities. We have to stop this. And we know that young people bring about a great deal of innovation and creativity, specifically in official language minority communities. So what are we doing, and how can we work with young people to stimulate the interest to stay here and to create here, rather than having to turn to the large cities? So, Mr. Deveau, thank you for that question. I'm very pleased to be able to answer that question. First of all, our young people are highly qualified, and whether this be in the regions and in the large metropolitan areas, where there are many challenges. In the regions, we have connectivity issues. Resolving this connectivity issues and developing strategies by organizations such as the Conseil de Développement Économique would foster the inclusion of these people, would enable us to bring back these young people to our regions. And that is very important in our regions. In fact, there are studies that show that most entrepreneurs launch their companies after the age of 40. So if we could repatriate these young people in those ages, then we would have budding employees who could enable our regions to flourish and who could contribute capital, bring in capital to our regions. And that really is the crux of the matter. Mr. Dalchin, would you also like to speak to that? Very quickly, I think the issue of mobility is there. We want to remain present in rural areas, but we need to have access to what's taking place elsewhere, and that's high-speed internet in rural regions, which unfortunately is not always available. And secondly, without having an airport in each community, we have to provide air services, enabling us to once, twice, 3 times a year to go to large centers to attend meetings, and that would help our rural regions and maintain people there, but at the same time, we would remain open to the rest of the country and the world. So for me, these are key elements: high-speed internet and airport services. So Mr. Godet had asked about the best practices and asking you to share those. I really like that. But maybe you could speak about the hindrances, the challenges faced by our communities when it comes to success. We'd like to hear that, because that way we can see how we can overcome these hindrances and put in place best practices to develop solutions. Thank you, Mr. Sanson. The next questions will come from our second vice chair of the committee, Mr. Mario Beaulieu, for the Bloc Québécois. Yes, please go ahead, Mr. Beaulieu. You have 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our guests. My first question is for Mr. Devaux. You spoke about how important territory is in terms of immigration. Could you maybe elaborate on that? Immigration, not only in Canada, is an urban phenomenon, regardless of where it is. If immigration is to serve Francophone developments, we need to ensure that these French-speaking communities be a tool for welcoming immigrants, and that's what we focus on at my organizations. We're putting together cohort. Again, this brings me back to the importance of finding a research action. We're trying to put together a pilot project to develop best practices throughout the rest of the province, and so to also work on partnerships across the country. So this is really about regionalizing immigration. And this is because you believe that Francophone communities are more present in rural areas, or where English is mostly spoken in urban centers. Well, that's exactly it. That's exactly the question. So most Francophone communities are in rural areas. Usually it's at the expense of major centers. If you look at Nova Scotia, the largest pool of Francophones are around Halifax, are people who move there either from other provinces, such as Quebec, mostly, but they also come in through immigration. Halifax really benefits from Francophone immigration from Inverness, Chitikan, and other areas, and we're trying and find solutions with the provinces to encourage a better distribution of immigrants across the province, more specifically to areas where it is more likely that French will be sustained. Charles Castonguay, for example, said that immigration, when this occurs in a community with more Francophones, makes it more likely that immigrants will speak French, will use French, and that they're able to maintain their Francophone identity. Do you agree with that statement? Yes, absolutely. In fact, they will integrate. But we need a matrix. We can't do it one immigrant at a time. That's where the idea of the cohort comes into play. People intend to integrate better through a group rather than individually. Yes, but if we want to help these immigrants to settle in, and in areas like Baie Sainte-Marie, where life still takes place in French, this gives us as a community an opportunity to stay alive, but it also gives a better opportunity to these persons to integrate and to join the larger Canadian Francophone family. Well, it's reassuring to hear you say that, because I think that statement was rather poorly received. That is to try and focus certain regions. Is that not to say that you're going to depopulate other regions? Because when, for instance, you look at the language transfer rates of Francophones outside of Quebec, it increases at each census. And do you believe that we should put in place measures to counter those particular measures? And again, to come back to the theme of our more economic studies, you said, well, the working language is English. So in order to, should we counter that? Is there a means to make the working language French in Nova Scotia or elsewhere? Well, the answer is yes, in some institutions, especially in education. I'm sorry, but you know that we're the second or the third largest fishing products industry, and we work with clients all over the world, and we exchange with them. In the background, we speak French, but the actual work is done in English. And I think that is going to continue. But at least if these particular industries, these investments are done in communities like Sainte-Marie or the Acadian Peninsula in New Brunswick, the community has the opportunity to actually survive. It will be able to build its community. And if that's the case, I think that's a win-win. Well, maybe that's why economic development is so important for Francophone communities outside of Quebec, because what we see is in those communities where the working language is French, the owners are often French. I think that's a very important relationship. And that is why the business community in French language communities outside of Quebec can develop better. And if they're able to flourish, they'll be able to establish workplaces where French is active. Should I respond? May I respond? You've got 20 seconds. You're absolutely correct, because there are certain areas that we need to focus on. Specifically, we should look at culture, education, tourism. Absolutely. But there are other areas as well, such as the international markets, where it's capital that speaks. And that means that we need to invest in communities where French is a major language. And I think that would be a winning factor. Thank you very much, Mr. Devaux. And you have exceeded your 20 seconds, Mr. Beaulieu. So we're going to end our 6-minute round with the NDP, with Ms. Ashton. Ms. Ashton, you have the floor for 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup et merci beaucoup à nos témoins. Je trouve vraiment ce que vous avez partagé avec nous.
Thank you, and thank you to our witnesses. I found all of what you have shared very interesting. It's exactly what we're experiencing here in Manitoba and what we've heard from our Francophone communities. There's so many parallels with what we've heard from St. Boniface, from the urban community, but specifically from the rural communities in our province. And we've also heard that in the prairies. I'd like to thank you for having shared with us your ideas and recommendations that are so clear. As my colleagues now know on the committee, it's been almost 3 years now that I have mentioned the need to invest in the early child care system as well as in education, because I have experienced my own issues personally where we have a French language daycare centers, but because of the labor shortage, I was never successful in sending my children to that child care center. And we know that as time goes on, parents don't have that opportunity, and they'll simply, the children will speak in English, and sometimes it's just too late. So I'd like to ask both of you, beginning with Mr. Desjardins, is that at what point does it become important to invest in early childhood Regarding infrastructure, we know that we need childcare centers, daycare centers, as well as staff, because after all, without any staff, even with the best center in the world, we can't welcome children. And when should these investments be made, and how stable should they be, and should these be done by the federal government? And to what extent is this investment key for us to keep young families in our communities? Well, in my mind, it's key, and on several levels. We're hearing a great deal about the labor shortage, but I think we need to foster or help families and parents, regardless of who wants to join the labor market, in order to have access to childcare centers. This is key to foster this integration and help persons who want to join the labor force. And secondly, when it comes to language issues, often there's a challenge we're facing. In Manitoba, it's similar to our situation, is that there are options available, and often these are bilingual options. Often bilingual means that that English becomes the dominant language. This is why it's all the more important to have early childcare centers in French. It's said that you catch English in the street and that you don't need to go to daycare or to school to learn English. And so it is absolutely essential in my mind. And a third point is the issue of affordability. Not all parents can afford to pay high fees to send their children to daycare. And some, unfortunately, have to make the choice to stay home with 2 children, or sometimes these are single family households. It isn't a choice necessarily, because it's simply a financial reality when the fees are so high. So, and I'd add a last point to this. Provincial governments have to be around the table as partners, because after all, they are the ones who will operationalize the funds. And if this is not appropriately done, despite the directives that you give them at the federal level, when it comes time to be present in the field, this doesn't necessarily make French language daycare centers available, and then we're missing the boat.
Avec le temps, merci beaucoup. Avec le temps
thank you very much. So with time, I'll change the focus perhaps. Mr. DeVoe, you've talked about the essential role that international students play, and we know that ministers of immigration made an important announcement saying that we're going to reduce the number of international students, and unfortunately there's been no promises to exempt French language institutions of this. We've heard about the AQC, who's been very preoccupied by this. Our institutions depend on international students as well as the communities. And what is also worrying is that the international community has heard this, and now people are thinking of going elsewhere rather than coming to Canada and coming here. Can you tell us what your thoughts are and make recommendation? Is it important to have an exemption for international students who would be pursuing their studies only in French? I will be very efficient and I will say yes. Yes to everything you have said. We know that there is a market for international education. It is sometimes it can be rather cynical, the way that international students can be seen in a monetary way, but nevertheless, it is a very important part of our plans as a society and for our survival and for the development of our communities. Thank you. How much time do I have, Mr. Chairman? You've already had 6 minutes and 5 seconds. Thank you very much, Mrs. Ashton. So next round of questions, because we don't have a lot of time left. We have to finish at 5:30 on the nose. So we've got a few 4 minutes and 4 minutes, Mr. Dalton. You've got the floor. Thank you to the witnesses. Mr. Desjardins, you have talked about what the definition of small businesses is, and that made me a little bit worried because we are making a lot of investments, and of course we don't want to waste money. We want to do our very best to help Francophone businesses who are in a linguistic minority situation. Can you talk to us a little bit more about this? And what is the definition for a Francophone business? What would you suggest that we use as a definition? Well, we were talking about what an entrepreneur is, a Francophone entrepreneur. Is he the manager? Is he the owner of the business? This is part of the challenge here. What I would say that in Francophone communities, in minority situations, if the employees can function and work in French, and that the CEO or the manager and the owner is an Anglophone, it doesn't matter. For me, this is still a French-speaking business because the Francophones in that community can work in French. So my tendency is to widen the definition. Let's say it's a multinational community and they go into a community and they employ the French-speaking people of that community. So even if they come from Germany, let's say, as an example, the people are working and living in that Francophone community. And so in that context, I think we need to be more of a generalist when it comes to the definition. Do you see any advantages with these investments? Yes, because often in the old days, in order to get a job, you had to leave. And now when you have an economic activity within your own region, people at least have a choice. I will never, of course, condemn somebody who wants to go somewhere else and live and work somewhere else. But what poses me a problem is that when people want to stay in their communities, very often Francophone and rural, but who have no other choice, no other opportunities open to them. And so whether we're talking about entrepreneurs that are local or from the outside who come and set up shop there, if we can create jobs and opportunities that are quality jobs where people can have a nice life because of them, I think that this is something we absolutely needs to be lauded. We heard a witness who talked about Francophone immigrants and from other places as well. And he's mentioned the issue of housing and how difficult it is to find lodgings and to integrate people. I think Mr. Deveau mentioned this. You also mentioned how important it is for Nova Scotia and the Maritimes to get immigrants. So there's a tension. Do you have the capacity to support these immigrants in the regions? Could you talk to us a bit more about this challenge? This is a really good question, but your 4 minutes are up, unfortunately. Mr. Makseri for 4 minutes as well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses from New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. I'm a proud Francophone Ontarian, Franco-Ontarian, so I'm sure that we have cousins here, and I totally understand where you're coming from and appreciate the information. I know I don't have a lot of time. My question has to do with the role of provinces and municipalities when we're talking about labor and labor shortages. And when we're talking about shortages, we're also saying that we also have a lack of services in French, especially when it comes to healthcare, education, which is a provincial jurisdiction, as well as the legal the legal services in French as well. How could we work more with other provinces? And national organizations tell us, well, if it's a minority situation, it's federal, but we are citizens of the provinces as well, so the provinces have their role to play as well. What do you think that the provinces should do in order to support the Francophonie in these situations? I'll try and answer. When it comes to immigration in Nova Scotia, we have a very interesting situation. And in successive governments, there's been a partnership between the Economic Development Council and the Provincial Department of Immigration and other actors. And we've tried to target and develop a Francophone immigration and whose aim is to solve problems rather than create them. So one good example to look at, and I know the federal government has its role to play as well. But for instance, when it comes to early childhood, I want to draw your attention to something in Nova Scotia. The transfers towards the province don't necessarily resolve these problems. I would invite you to support us provincially when it comes to early childhood, to make sure that the education system is protected, the Francophone education system in Nova Scotia is protected. Yes, what I could add is that provincially speaking, it will depend on the priorities of the government in power. I don't think that we can conclude unilaterally something that will be good or affect every single territory and province. So all three levels of government are essential, and we need to all work together with the same goals in mind. We need to make sure that the services exist. But of course, everybody has their part to play. And if one develops a priority, but the other ones don't, then it will probably not get the desired results. 30 seconds. So could you, in your recommendations, when it comes to rurality, and this is very specific issues, tell us more. So if you have any data that is specifically good here, what can we get as Francophone data? And what are your recommendations? What should we as the federal government do to get better results? Thank you so much. We'll get back to this. So no, Mr. Beaulieu, you have 1 minute. That's a question's worth. I'll try and be brief and get the guests to still. We've talked about how important it is to have French language services within the workplace. We're supposed to have these outside of Quebec as well, to be able to support French language services in federally run businesses. Do you think that within the federal institutions where there are more Francophones, should French not be the dominant language? I'm more aware of the New Brunswick situation, of course, but when you are in certain regions, especially the north of the province, and even around Moncton, the language in the workplace is often French. So I've worked at fisheries and oceans and I spoke French there when I was a student. And also, I preside a small caisse de dépôt where we speak, of course, French so thank you so much, Mr. Beaulieu. Okay, so Madam Ashton, you have 1 minute. Okay, very quickly, Mr. Desjardins, we talked about the labor shortage in teaching and other places. Do you think that fixing this is essential to the development of our communities. Yes, it's fundamental. Solutions take time to develop, so we need to act now so that we can get results in a few years. We need to support post-secondary institutions, and this is absolutely essential. Mr. Devaux, sorry. Yes, it's very important that teachers be trained here within the Canadian context. Thank you, Mrs. Ashton. Thank you to all witnesses. I'm very sorry to have to cut everybody short. We have to suspend the committee right now, and we were a little bit late, unfortunately, because of the vote today, but that's what happens in Parliament. So we had to cut 15 minutes. So we're very sorry about that. Thank you to all witnesses. If you have any other information that you would like to communicate to us in writing, please send it to our clerk, who will share this information with all of the committee members, and your written information is just as important as your oral testimony. I want to, just before we finish, I want to say a big and warm welcome to Annie Koutrakis of the Liberal Party, who has joined our committee, and Mr. Manjouder, who is replacing a colleague in the Conservatives. So thank you very much, everyone, and we are presently adjourned. Thank you.